Today, I want to know what effect, if any, does fermentation have on making hot sauce. To test this, I'll be setting up what's known as a blind triangle test to help counteract cognitive biases and kind of semi-scientifically determine whether or not fermentation is important to making hot sauce. Fermentation is the process where natural bacteria like natural yeast and lactobacillus begin processing available sugars and turning it into other stuff. Most commercial hot sauces you probably had, like Tabasco for example, fall into this category. When looking at recipes online, sources tend to vary on whether or not fermentation is actually required. So the question is, how crucial is fermentation to the flavor of hot sauce? To test this, I'll be making two separate hot sauces, all from the same batch. One that ferments because of its ability to interact with the air, and another which I will freeze during the time the other one is fermenting. So first things first, we need to make a hot sauce. I chose to go with a simple hot sauce, with no frills and no exotic ingredients that will muddle up the comparison. For our peppers, I used 500 grams, or about 1 pound of jalapeno peppers. I washed them, then cut the stems off. For a little flavor, I added 1 head of garlic, about 20 cloves. Lastly, I added 1% of the weight of the peppers, in this case 5 grams. I then placed these ingredients into a food processor and pulsed them until I got a rough pulp. This is what's known as a pepper mash. I divided the pepper mash into 2 separate jars. The first jar I placed a paper towel over and secured it so that nothing got in, but also that it could interact with the atmosphere and ferment. The second jar I put into the freezer. By placing it in the freezer, the bacteria was hindered and fermentation did not occur, or at least not majorly. Each day I mixed the fermenting batch, careful to sanitize the equipment so I didn't introduce any new bacteria in before mixing. After 1 week of fermentation, I thawed out the frozen batch, and then went to the last stage of making the hot sauce. Starting with the non-fermented batch, I blended it with a stick blender, then ran it through a fine sieve. I weighed how much pepper sauce I had collected, and then added 88% of that amount in white distilled vinegar. Then I funneled the batch into a jar. And then for this case, I labeled it Sauce 1. I repeated this for the fermented batch, being careful not to have any sort of cross-contamination. Once everything was bottled, it was time to see if the fermentation had made any difference. To do this, I set up what's known as a blind triangle test. For this, you'll need some volunteers, but the premise for the test is actually pretty simple. These kind of tests are perfect for helping figure out if two things are objectively different, or if we just think that they are. Away from the volunteer, pull out 3 chips to serve the sauce on. Take a sample from the unfermented batch, placing it on a chip. Then do the same for the fermented batch. Lastly, pick either the fermented or the unfermented, but try to do this in a fair way. So in my case, I used a coin. Make sure you know which is which, preferably by taking notes. But you want to do this where the volunteer can't see. Allow the volunteer to taste all 3 samples. Ask them if they can tell which sample is different from the other 2. If they get it right, ask them why. If they get it wrong, it's possible the difference is so minute that it's really hard to actually tell the difference. I ran this test on a few of my friends, and this was their response. Almost all of them could tell that there was actually a difference between the 2 of them. Some couldn't tell me exactly why, some could immediately tell me why. Running these experiments several times will give you more accurate results. But with my volunteers, I feel pretty confident in saying that the fermented sauce had a completely and drastically different flavor than the unfermented batch. For one, the unfermented batch was spicier. The fermented batch had much more of a mellowed, quote-unquote, complex flavor, meaning that the fermented hot sauce, there are more flavors apparent as opposed to the unfermented, which just had one strong jalapeno pepper flavor, without any other surrounding flavors. Myself, under the blind trial, I found that I liked the fermented batch better, but this was by far not the consensus. Some people preferred the unfermented, some people preferred the fermented. So this just goes to show that you should make it yourself and see which one you like better. One thing that you have to keep in mind when running these sorts of tests is that errors can creep into your experiment, such as jars imparting flavor. Trying to understand what these could be will help you run future experiments, as well as judge whether or not you should be confident in the results that you have. The fun part is that you should be able to run the experiment yourself and see similar results. That is the beauty of science. If your result is different, it might hint that there's some factor that I overlooked that's more important than was expected, helping us figure out what exactly makes a tasty hot sauce. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you enjoyed this more sciencey video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing or giving a thumbs up. All of that stuff really helps me a lot. Thank you!